So I made this little thing called Fabric in an hour for you guys. But as such, I want to basically start a little bit like what is Fabric? And in an hour, I want to show you how you can build sort of a complete end-to-end solution using Fabric. But yeah, let's see where we end up with this. I think you all heard about Fabric if you've been on the latest, like last week it was released at Build. It's a public preview, but it's basically like if you've worked with Synapse. Synapse is more like the past way of doing things, while Fabric is now for stuff sort of more of a SaaS experience. It's built into sort of the Power BI experience together with all the engineering stuff that you have, like data engineering, like data warehousing and all that. It's just in one piece. And but some more details on that later. So my name is Stijn Wynants. I am customer engineer and all that. I live in Belgium. We have this yearly conference that we call DataMinds Connect, but let's get going. So what basically is Microsoft Fabric? So Microsoft Fabric is now sort of an end-to-end analytical solution that we've built. Like previously, you would have Synapse Analytics, where you would have your Synapse Spark, where you would have your data warehouse, your dedicated SQL pools, or your serverless SQL pools. You would have an AWS storage account linked to it. You could connect to that Azure Synapse using Power BI and then going to the dedicated SQL endpoint or the serverless endpoint to actually load that data in there, or go to your data lake using the Power BI connector for Delta, for Parquet, for CSV, whatever you want to use. Now in this one, we're basically including all those things in one bit. Basically data movement, data lakes, data engineering, data integration, data science, real-time analytics, and business intelligence all packed in one shared platform. Also handling data security, governance, and compliance in one place. So basically, if you start up Microsoft Fabric, it's your one place where everything's at. Well, previously you would have your different items. Now you basically have it all in one place, and you don't really need to worry that much about capacity and all those things. There is a lot that's going on there, but as a user or as an engineer, it does make things a lot easier, and it integrates way better than in current environments. Now, what does Microsoft Fabric encompass? Like, what is everything that's in here? So basically, we've got data integration in here. If you guys know Data Factory, Data Factory is basically your data integration. Data integration basically means that your data factory, your pipelines are still there. There's a new data flow component, which is built upon Power Query. Well, previously it was sort of the Spark engine that was between underneath it, which was the data flows that you had in Synapse. You could use it, but it was not that user-friendly specifically. It's user-friendly, but it didn't allow you to do any metadata management and all those things. It did allow you, but then you made it so complex that it was actually hard to manage. Now with the data flows in Power Query, it's a bit better. Data engineering, which is basically your Synapse Spark. So anything you have in Synapse Spark is in there, but there's some cool new stuff that's in there as well. I'll talk a bit more on that later. We'll focus on each of these points, except three. I'll talk a bit about that later. Then there's data warehouse. Data warehouse concept has completely changed. If you know everything about dedicated SQL pool and serverless SQL pools, it's more the serverless SQL pool way of doing things, while dedicated SQL pools with the 60 distributions and the very high learning curve and the workload management, capacity management was really hard. Like I used to work a lot with dedicated SQL pools, and just getting that thing to work really well took some time. And you needed to keep an eye on it every day to make sure that everything kept going well, because you were limited to an amount of concurrent users. That's all gone. It's a completely different concept that we have there. Data science, I'm not a data science guy, but know that it's in there. Real-time analytics, also not going to focus on that today, but basically know that's in there. And then it's all built sort of inside of Power BI now. So you get sort of the Power BI click experience. So if you want to, for example, try this out, it's free. You get 60 days for free with any capacity, some limited capacity, but basically free capacity. You don't have to pay for it. And it's going through powerbi.com and then enabling Fabric. Just look like Fabric trial, and it will walk you through how to set it up. It's really easy to use, and it's fun to use as well. And then underneath, there's this whole big glue thing, which I like to call it a glue. It's basically one lake. Previously, you would have storage accounts, which basically have Delta tables. And then that data warehouse would have dedicated SQL pool tables, which is in a different storage. And then for anything that you're storing, also for Power BI, it's all different silos that you're building there. One lake basically is one copy of your data that's across all these compute engines, and all compute engines can use that copy of data in a very performant way. And of course, Purview is going to be built around it. Any questions so far? So that's like a very brief introduction what Fabric is. Like, these are all the topics that we'll be dealing with today. So we're talking about data integration, data engineering, data warehouse. We're not talking about data science because it's not my thing. Real-time analytics, same. But business intelligence, we'll briefly touch about it because I'm not a reporting guy, but I'll show you basically how to use a thing called Direct Lake, which is pretty cool. Just come off mute, Mark or Michael, if there's any questions.
No, we're fine. There's no questions so far, thanks.
Okay, good. So what are we going to do today? So what I want to do is I'm going to build out a common architecture in 1 hour using Fabric. Now, the common architecture I've chosen is, maybe I'm a bit biased because I work with these types of clients every day. It's basically Lakehouse with a dedicated SQL pool at the end. So Lakehouse basically meaning that you're going to have data in landing zone, so you get all these different sources that where data is coming from. Let's say a SQLDB, SharePoint, whatever you want to put your data in there, and you're landing that in the lake, sort of a landing zone layer. Once it's in that landing zone layer, you're moving that to these 3 different layers: the medallion architecture, what people might know or not know. I'll just briefly touch upon it. Bronze is basically loading data from those sources close to source and just applying some auditing columns to it. For example, saying like, this is the user that loaded it, this is a timestamp that loaded it, and then you're going to actually store that in Delta. Now, Delta is sort of a format which is built upon Parquet. So Parquet files are basically columnar-based storage. It's a file that is in a columnar way, stored in a columnar way. Now, but one problem with those files is if you load to a Parquet file and you then want to insert, update, or delete a value against it, it's not possible because a Parquet file as such in its nature is immutable, which basically means that you cannot change that file once it's written. It's also because the metadata is at the end. I have another session which goes deep into Parquet and how it's built, but that's all you need to know. So columnar storage, it's basically like a column store index, and the metadata is written at the end, which makes it hard to actually insert, update, or delete against that specific one file because it would screw up with the compression and all those things. Now, Delta is a format that's been written around it, sort of a framework, which allows you to do CRUD operations, so create, update, delete, insert statements against those Parquet files, because it basically builds a transaction log above it inside something called JSON. And there will be JSON objects for all changes that you're doing. And then you can basically go and look what the data is now and then try and travel back. Like the previous time you loaded the data, opens up a load of capabilities, but it actually also ensures your asset compliance and it allows you to do CRUD operation. That's why Delta is really a big thing. If you haven't looked at Delta, make sure you look at it, because looking at an analytical way of working, this is one of the key things you need to start looking at. So we'll be building out sort of a lakehouse. A lakehouse basically getting data using Data Factory. In our part, it's going to be data integration, Data Factory in Fabric. We're loading that data to a landing zone. Once it's in our landing zone, we're going to move that data to a bronze layer, which we're going to put it in sort of a Delta format, which will happen automatically, but I'll show you in a bit. We're going to massage that data a little bit and then move it to a silver layer. And then in a gold layer, we're not going to use the data lake. We're going to use the new warehouse modes that we have. And I'm going to show you that you can finally, for example, do cross-DB queries with different warehouses that you have and lake houses that you have, which is pretty nifty and pretty cool. And then all the way at the end, we're going to create a Power BI dashboard out of it. Okay. Now, so the topics we'll be covering today out of this whole thing is data integration, data engineering, data warehouse, and Power BI. All the other ones I'm not covering today because it will be too much in an hour. Was there a question? Because I saw Q&A pop up for a second. No questions?
No questions.
Let's move on. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about OneLake. Now, why is OneLake such a good idea? So OneLake is sort of AWS Gen 2 storage, which is underneath that SaaS Fabric experience. And it basically, any data that you're going to link or load into your Fabric workspace is going to end up in that OneLake. And then all different compute engines that you have, like Data Warehouse, Spark, data science engines, can all use that OneLake copy of that data. So that OneLake will have data in there, and each compute engine can actually go to that data, manage that data, insert that data, select from that data in a very easy way. So it's one copy of your data that you're storing and not multiple copies. But previously you would have stored like a copy for your data warehouse, dedicated SQL pool. They would have a copy for your Delta tables, and you might have something also in an analytical engine for Power BI. You might want to store some stuff for data science as well, but now it's all in one place. And it's all built on Delta. I just gave you a brief explanation about what Delta is. So this is basically the open framework that we're currently supporting. So everything is in Delta. So the Delta format is our go-to thing because it has been proven by, for example, Synapse and Databricks that it's a really good thing to use, and it can perform really well, and it scales really well. And what we're trying to do with this is basically avoid any data silos we might create. Data silos meaning that you would have a dedicated SQL pool which has this data, and you have a Spark engine with Delta tables that has its own data. We basically want to make sure that it's all in one format, which means that any compute engine can access it. And also the data that's in there, it's in Delta format. Any other engine, for example, Databricks, should be able to tap into the data that you have in that one lake. Or you can have Databricks loading to one lake as well. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is data integration. Now, data integration is sort of your Azure Data Factory, and what you're going to do with that data integration tool is basically move data from sources to one lake. Like what I see a lot of customers do, they have a lot of SQL DBs or SQL servers on-prem, or some SharePoint data, or some Excel, some CSVs that you want to load, and you basically want to load that to one location. And that's basically your starting point where you're going to be able to load data and actually query data and massage that data to make that data more actionable. But you basically want to do that in one place so that everything is sort of in a framework that data will flow through, gets validated, and at the end you get business, you can apply business logic to it. Like looking at the lakehouse architecture, this is the very first part. It's just loading that data into your lake, just pushing it in there and trying to make that also an incremental load. For example, every day you're loading the last day of data, you'll have a folder which specifies it's this day, and I'm just loading this specific folder here. And those are actually things you can do with Azure Data Factory pipelines. Now, another very, very cool thing is shortcuts. Let's say you have got a data lake. You've already designed it. You've got Delta tables in there. You've got the lakehouse. Your data is already being managed there. And you actually just want to tap into that data. You want to tap into that existing data. We've got something called shortcuts, which allows you to actually connect to AWS Gen 2, and it's propagated into our one lake, and it shows you that data as it is on your other database, on your other data lake. And you can actually just say right-click, load this to a table, right-click, load this to Spark, and it automatically handles that for you. Well, previously we would have connections and all those things. That's basically handled by those shortcuts. And another thing inside data integration is data flows. I will not be touching too much on data flows because, yeah, I want to show you the scenario that I'm showing, but know that data flows are still there and they're now built upon Power Query. Now, what else did I want to say here? Maybe one more thing on shortcuts. Shortcuts can be done not only for data integration, it can be built in Spark into your data engineering part, it can be built into your warehousing part, and you can actually link tables. So let's say you have a Delta table which already exists in your existing AWS Gen 2. You can just link that Delta table in there and it will become sort of a managed table which allowing you to insert, read, write to those tables. Now, well, let me show you the first bit. So moving data to one lake, how do you do it? And what things you need to know about that. So let me move over here. I'm getting my specific one here. Just head over here. There we go. So if you're starting up, 1 second, I need to pop up this here. So once you basically see your Fabric experience, it's appfabric.microsoft.com. You log in, you basically get like sort of a Power BI login, and this is like basically your home page. On the left bottom here, you see all these different things. Let me just zoom in a little bit. You've got Power BI here, Data Factory, and then all the data engineering, science, warehouse, and real-time analytics. That's basically a part of Microsoft Fabric. Now, because we're going to talk about the data integration part, we're going to go to our Data Factory part. Inside our Data Factory part, you can see over here, you can do two things. You can either create a data flow Gen 2, which is built on Power Query, or a data pipeline. Now, I could build a data pipeline, but then in an hour, I would never be able to build such a full solution. So I'm going to just show you one that I already created. Now, as you can see over here, you've got the quick access things over here. And over here, I have a data pipeline called ingest SQL DB. Now, what I'm doing in this SQL DB over here is I'm basically going to get some data. I'm using metadata from SQL. I don't know if there's any SQL Server guys here. I used to be a SQL Server DBA, so I still like to use like DMVs and all that stuff to automate stuff in one go. So you can see over here, I just added a lookup task. If you want to know how to do that, let's see over here, there's activities. And then you say, okay, add me a lookup. And a lookup basically means get some information and then use that information later on in my pipeline. Now, in this get tables here, we go to settings. I'm actually going to select from a query. You can see here from sys tables, I'm getting two specific tables in here. Did that wrong. I get a schema name and I get the table name from sys tables. Now, one thing to note here, still the same for Azure Data Factory, but for people that haven't seen this, just for your reference, I'll show you. You need to create a connection to it. I created a connection here to my Cthulhu database.windows.net, which is an Azure SQL DB. And I've got White World Importers ZW in there, which contains these two specific tables. Let me just show you over here. A few seconds. I don't have any. Anyway, just believe me. If you, I'll click new, then you can see what's happening. So you basically create a new connection. You say, hey, which one do I want to connect to? In my case, Azure SQL Database. And then once you've clicked Azure SQL Database, it gives in the server database. So one thing that's not in there for the people that use Azure Data Factory a lot previously is in there is sort of a metadata managed way of doing the server and database name. I used to like to also put that in sort of parameters, so I can actually use one pipeline to connect to any SQL Server or any Azure SQL DB I have. That's currently not in there yet, but will probably be coming soon, I guess. Once I've done that lookup gives an output, and that output is then taken into a for each activity. You can see that over here. There's a for each activity, and that for each activity does one thing. It loops every item that comes from that specific activity get tables, which is the lookup you can see over here. Now, once we've got that output value, we're going to loop those tables, and what we're doing there is we're taking a source. We're pointing to a specific query. What I'm doing here, it's some, if you like to write dynamic SQL, I think you're going to love the dynamic content builder of a pipeline expression builder. I have spent so many time on this and debugging, but hey, it's easy once you know how to do it. So I'm just concatenating a select star from table name, schema name, and table name, basically of that iteration of those tables. And then I'm loading that to a destination. And this is where things change. Well, previously you would say, hey, load this to a data lake. I'm now loading this to a workspace data storage type, which is a lakehouse. Now, a lakehouse is sort of the bits that you're going to use to build out things you're going to use in your Synapse Spark environment. I'll say, go to my lakehouse called landing zone. And I'm not going to push this into a table. I'm going to push this into files. Sorry, files. And then I'm going to concatenate the file path that I want to use for this. And as you can see here in my landing zone, I will have a concatenated path, so landing zone, WWI imports DW, the schema name and the table name. For example, if you're doing this in a production environment, what you want to do is, for example, add a timestamp or anything like that, load date, or an ID of the load or anything like that. That's, you're free to do whatever you want. And it's basically just building your folder structure in one lake, not in data lake, but just in one lake. And I'm pushing this over here to Parquet format. Okay. Now, I've run this already, and what it actually does, let me head over to that landing zone. So now I need to go to that lakehouse, and that lakehouse you can find underneath data engineering. And over here, you can see landing zone. And what this did was here, landing zone, so you can see WWM importers, facts, and then that sales table with a Parquet file. really easy, really simple, really straightforward. And that basically allows me to just take data and then just incrementally start loading that to my one lake. Now, let's say I already have data. I have data and I have an existing landing zone. I just want to keep using that data factory that I'm loading that existing landing zone to. You can actually just create a shortcut. And a shortcut you can create like this, new shortcut. And then you can say you've got 3 different sources. You've got Microsoft OneLake, so things that are inside OneLake already to use in another place. You can use it with Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, and you can even connect to Amazon. Let's say we're going to click Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. The thing you need to do there is give in your URL. One very, very specific thing I want to note here is make sure you specify DFS. If you specify blob, you will get all kinds of errors that don't explain anything. So make sure you use DFS to make sure that you get the right experience. And then you say create new connection, and then it automatically creates a connection name, and then what type of authentication you want to use. You can use organizational account key, SaaS, or service principal, depending on what fits your bill. And then it basically links that data in there. And as you can see here, I've got this existing landing zone with a landing folder, which has roles, a JSON folder, which has all this data in there, and you can see some JSON files in there. So it's very, very simple tapping into existing data that I have. So if you already got a process that's loading data there, you can just right-click it from there on, and then just get properties from it, and you get URLs to start using it. That basically concludes a little bit the integration part. So there's 2 ways of integrating with data. There's no 3 ways. First one is using sort of your pipelines, like copying data over. And there's shortcuts to existing data using the thing that I just shown you here. And there's also a way basically to connect with Power BI data flows to, Fabric data flows to sources, and then moving that data to OneLake as well. Any questions so far? No questions? Okay, let's head back to my presentation. So we've got that data in our landing zone. Once that data is in our landing zone, we basically want to start doing some stuff with it. And that's where data engineering comes in. So now what we want to do, we want to take that data from a landing zone and actually build a bronze and a silver layer. And in our case, it will be a bronze lakehouse and a silver lakehouse. And we're going to load data there from sources. From that source, we want to keep close to that source. We're not going to apply any business logic yet. We basically just want to get like data from our first bit, add some auditing columns, and then from bronze to silver, we're going to do some data quality checks. We're going to check if we, so data quality checks, removing bad rows, checking our data types, making sure everything is set properly. So we have clean data, and everybody that wants to start using that data can go to that silver layer and say, okay, this is my source data in a perfect format, and I can start building business logic in my gold layer based upon that silver layer. Usually bronze and silver is something that is completely automated. You usually just write a framework around it, do all the checks, you basically make it metadata managed, where you're just going to push out some rules that you're going to apply to it. Now, what is different between Azure Synapse and Fabric is now you also have something called single load support, as you can see over here. So you can actually create clusters with a single load. Another thing that's new is Lakehouse endpoints. Previously, you would have serverless SQL pools that was linked in your Synapse environment. So if you create a table inside Spark, it would pop up in your serverless SQL pool. Now, here you have actually a SQL endpoint, which is automatically linked once you create a lakehouse, which means that any data that you have loaded to sort of a table inside Spark, you can start querying with the SQL language. So only read. It's not for writing, but you can already read that data using that SQL endpoint there. One of the main things I did not like about Synapse Spark was it took about 3 minutes, 4 minutes sometimes, if you were unlucky, 9 minutes to set up, to start up that cluster. Now with it really has fast startup times, and the fast startup times is basically on less than 10 seconds that your cluster is up and running and starts. You can start loading data to your data frames and all that stuff. Another big change between Synapse Spark and Fabric is you've got high concurrency mode. Previously, if you had a notebook and you had a session, and you would then run another session, it would have some sort of walkover time, which also took 1 or 2 minutes. Now it's within 5 seconds that it basically picks up the next session and starts doing work. While previously that session sharing was really, really different. Now, that data engineering part is used to build our bronze or a silver layer. I'll show, for time's sake, just how you build sort of a bronze layer out of that landing zone data that I just created. So creating a silver layer, creating a bronze and silver layer. I'll show you what I'm doing here. And I'm just going to use some notebooks and Spark and show you like the differences between Synapse and Fabric and why I think Fabric is way, way better on this side. Let me head over here. Okay. So if I go to my data engineering part, you can see here that you have all these different tasks you can do. You can create a lakehouse. So that's basically creating sort of, if you look at this, you might be able to see this like a sort of a container where you're going to contain sort of actions you're going to do for a certain, so a landing zone container, so a landing zone lakehouse, a bronze lakehouse, silver lakehouse, gold lakehouse, and all those things. Then you've got notebooks to actually move data around between these different, in one link between these different layers, cleansing that data and all that stuff. Spark job definitions, that doesn't stay, that stays the same for any like tasks that are repetitive and can be automated in a job. Spark job definitions are your thing to go to. For development purposes, you usually go to notebooks, you create something very robust in notebooks, and then you make a Spark job definition out of it to actually automate those things a little bit further. But both performance-wise work the same. It also gives you options to make data pipelines, importing notebooks that you already have. You can also use a sample. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to head over to my bronze lakehouse. You can see over here, I've got bronze lakehouse. If I click on bronze lakehouse, you can see over here that I have a few tables already. I have pre-fetched some stuff. But what I want to show you here is I already linked in, like I know from my previous one, I already have that data landing zone in that existing landing zone. I can just go over here, go new shortcut, one lake, and then say landing zone next. And then I can just go and select these things and say, hey, create a shortcut for that in this specific lakehouse, which means I don't need to go and load that data in again. I don't need to make a linked service. This is the only action I need to take to actually go and get that data between those two different lakehouses, so those two different layers. Once it's in there, it's really easy to start using. Then you've got these tables in here, and you also see that there's a difference between the icons. So this is an icon, and this is a sale icon. So this is a table this is a table I loaded with Spark in Fabric. This, however, is a table that's in my AWS Gen 2 in the Synapse environment where I created that Delta table. So I can basically combine those two things and actually load Delta tables into it and just start using them there. There's also like this really cool button. How do I have one here? Landing roles. No, these are the JSON files. There's like a right click, and then you can just say create a table out of it. And it automatically creates, I think I can, wait, I have someone here. This here should be able to let me do it. You can see it has this thing called load tables. And it automatically creates a table out of that CSV or Parquet file that I have there, and it will load it into my Spark. Pretty cool. Now, of course, what we're going to use with Spark, this is just a lakehouse endpoint. It doesn't allow me to massage the data. It doesn't allow me to do any ETL sort of processes on it. So what I need for that are notebooks. And notebooks you can find over here. You can also, like, if I go back to this bronze thing here, I can say open notebook or create a new notebook. But I already opened it. And then once you open stuff, they pop up over here. So I'm just going to open up loading to bronze. Now, what I'm doing here, as you can see, I'm actually getting data from files landing zone and then that specific file. I can also just say, hey, put a star here. That should work as well. And you can see that I'm not putting ABFF, FS, SS, blah, 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 all that big connection string and making sure that it connects. No, this is just a shortcut I'm pointing to. All connection information is already there. If I'm a user that's allowed to connect to that specific one, I can just say, hey, files, landing zone, WWM, porters, fact, sale, and it just load that data in there. So just to show you how fast this thing started up, I'm just going to run this cell again. So it now started my session. So it takes about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. See, session started in 8 minutes, 0.2 seconds, while previously it took 3 minutes. So really, really good, really a lot faster. And then, for example, Spark code stays the same. I'm not going to dive too deep in it, but things you might want to do is, for example, add a load user, add a timestamp for your loading, and then maybe a row hash to actually say this is unique data for incremental loading purposes later on. So you can actually compare those hashes between landing zone and your Delta table. And then you can say, hey, write this and save as table. And save as table, you don't have to specify a database name, you don't have to create a database. The database is your lakehouse, so it's basically bronze.sale it creates. Okay, and that's it. Was there anything else I wanted to show here? Oh yeah, cluster settings. So normally you would have cluster settings. You can change stuff here as well. There are some defaults that are there, and there are things that you can change. So if we head over to, I think it was my workspace, and then workspace settings, and then data engineering, Spark Compute. Over here, you can see you've got this thing called starter pools. This is basically the default thing that is enabled, which is a 10 node, which is a choice that's been made now, but it will change later after public preview. But you can also say, hey, create me a new pool, and then just say, hey, one node pool. Memory optimize is the only option, and then node size, let's say small, and then just say no scale, no executors, just one node, create, and then say which runtime version, I'm on here right now, and then some properties you can say, and then save, and it will create my new Spark pool. Also library management, also you can put in libraries from PyPy or a YAML file, add to some YAML files, or you can put in custom libraries by uploading them here, like you would do in Synapse Spark, but it's now here under the workspace settings. Okay, any questions so far?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions. Keep those to the end if you don't mind.
Okay. Now, the next bit I want to talk to you about is data warehouse. Now, data warehouse is, remember, previously dedicated SQL pool. That was based upon PDW, which was the parallel data warehouse, which was the thing I started my career with. So the first thing I did, first weekend, I got a PDW and they said, make it faster. So it was a joy to work with. But basically that was used to build the APS appliance, and it's basically PDW, but it's the on-premise version of dedicated SQL pool or SQLDW. Then it was moved from the on-prem solution to the PaaS solution, which is called SQLDW, and then it became dedicated SQL pool, but it's basically still the sort of same engine underneath it, which was 60 distribution with all the compute nodes linked to it and all that stuff. Now, it changes completely. It's still SQL. You still can do whatever you want. You can have rollout security, dynamic data masking, all those things. Like the SQL engine stays the same, but it is a lot better on concurrency and moving data around and combining data between different warehouses, combining data with other lake houses is really, really easy to do. Now, this gives you sort of a single SQL engine for your workspace, which basically means that you don't have multiple SQL engines everywhere. You just have a SQL engine, and it just links to any of the data that you have in one link. So it's your compute. You can create a SQL engine for your HR department, you can create a SQL engine for your let's say finance department, but underneath it's just that one SQL engine. Gives you sort of autonomous workload management. Well, previously you need to do workload management and make sure that everybody only has access to, has resources to this and resources to this. This is basically managed automatically for you. There's no resource, there's no limits on concurrent queries at this point in time. And then a very big one, cross-database querying, which is finally in there after a very, very long time, which makes it very, very easy to have, for example, a HR warehouse that has some data and finance needs to get some data there and use it in the stored procedure. You can just reference that database and just do a cross-database query and it will work. There's two types of things. You've got the lakehouse, which is a SQL endpoint. Very important to note here, that's read-only, and warehouse. And warehouse is basically your warehousing mode. which gives you sort of managed tables. They'll still be in the Delta format underneath it, but it's managed tables, which basically means they have more cache and all that stuff in there, and you can do CRUD operations against it. So basically you can insert, update, or delete, or create tables, but underneath it will use one lake as well, which would be in Delta. Now, differences between these, licensing-wise, it's just Fabric or Power BI Premium. Primary capability is basically warehouse is a full data warehousing with full transactional support. SQL endpoint, which is linked to Lakehouse, I showed previously, is just for T-SQL querying and serving, and it's only read-only. Developer profile, the first for warehouse SQL developers and citizens developers. SQL endpoint is usually used by data engineers or SQL developers. So the recommended use cases are basically data warehousing for enterprise use, data warehousing supporting departmental business units or self-service use, structured data analysis in T-SQL, where you've written like all this complex logic in procedures, views, and tables, but you would like to move them into our Fabric environment. That basically gives you all of that. Now, for the SQL endpoint, you basically use it to actually explore and create as Delta tables from that lakehouse. So basically to see, like, I want to use this using SQL language. It's really easy to learn. If you're not that big on Spark, it just shows you a very quick way to explore those Delta tables. Then also for staging data and archival zone for analysis of those data, it just gives you like, you've got, let's say you've got some data and then there's data you need to keep for reference for 10 years, like financial data or something like that. It's never going to be queried, but sometimes you have to query it. That Lakehouse endpoint is linked to it, so you can actually use that to write a report on it. Medallion architecture with zones for bronze, silver, and gold analysis, and also pairing with warehouse for enterprise analytical use cases built upon only things that you're doing in Spark, and you're not going to build anything, you're not going to do any insert, updates, or deletes with that lakehouse. Come on, the slides are stuck. There we go. The development experience, basically warehouse editor with full support for T-SQL data ingestion, modeling, development, querying, UI experience for data ingestion, modeling, and querying, read-write support for first and also third-party tooling. It is asset compliant and it gives you the full TQL, DML, DDL, T-SQL support and full transaction support, while SQL endpoint limited T-SQL support for views, table valued functions, and SQL queries. UI is really limited for just modeling and querying, and limited support for first and third-party tooling. Transaction support is only read-only, so there's full data query language, but no DML, limited DDL, T-SQL support for views and table valued functions are there. Now, let me, come on, the slides are not moving anymore. There you go. So let's use that Lakehouse data that we've just created. Imagine that I also created a silver layer where I did all that cleansing and all that stuff, and we're now going to build out a warehouse with that. Let me head over here. So, go. So, first thing you need to do, you go on the left bottom, and then there's this thing called Data Warehouse. Just click it. To create a data warehouse, pretty simple. Click it, give a name, it creates a warehouse. No questions, DWs, or anything like that. Just basically creates a warehouse. Capacity will be managed by your admin, and it will basically sort of soothe and all that stuff, but not too much on that today. But basically, just here, a name, and it creates a warehouse in the background. It takes about 1 minute, 2 minutes. I'm not going to wait on that today. It's a cook and show, so I have already cooked it for you. And just to show you over here, I have this warehouse called roles. Now, why roles? I created this pre-com for SQL Bits, which was based upon data from Dungeons & Dragons, and these are the roles you do in Dungeons & Dragons. So there's some data there. Now, so here we go. So I'm loading up my warehouse, and one of the first things I want to show you, just go over here and put these things away. There you go. You see that you have all these different schemas. You can create schemas in the DBO tables. DBO schema, you've got functions there, stored procedures, tables, and views. Go and look at tables. There's nothing in there because I haven't created a table there. I've created my own schemas, for example, the dim schema over here, and I've got a table called dim username. And I've got a fact schema here, which has a table called roles in there, and this basically contains all that data that I want to use. Now, let's say I want to link, I just want to see the data that is in those other lakehouses I created, which are on the SQL endpoint, which are read-only. This warehouse is, I can write, I can insert, update, and delete. There's other ones I can read from, but I want to use that data as a source. And I want to actually see how that structure is built. What you can do is you click on plus warehouses, and then say, hey, bronze and landing zone, confirm. Just wait a few seconds, and they should be popping up. There you go. You see here, landing zone and bronze are there now. And I can go bronze, schemas, and a DBO tables. And you can see I have that roles table that I showed you before that I created in that Spark notebook. Now, let's say I want to start actually query those things. Like I want to use that roles table and then start creating a fact in a dimension. The facts in the dimension I created here. There's this thing called queries. So I've got my queries here, basically saving them automatically. It's like the SQL scripts you had in Synapse. You basically create a SQL script and then this one automatically saves. It works sort of like a notebook experience that once you start editing it, it saves your process, which means if your browser fails, you will still have your process. It will not require you to rewrite your whole stored procedure because you had an internet connection issue. And also, maybe very SSMS and all that stuff still works. Okay. Now, over here you can see, basically I can go to that bronze roles. I'm actually in my roles data warehouse, but I can actually go and say, hey, query this from that bronze lakehouse. I can just say, hey, run. You can see it automatically just goes and gives us the data that's in there with that row hash that we created and all that stuff. And you can also say like, hey, download this as an Excel file, but also save as a table. So you can actually write sort of a view or something like that, and then materialize that as an actual table to actually improve performance or just give access to a certain user to that result of your query. Sort of fuse in the background. Now, you can create schemas, and then you can also create tables, but just by referencing that bronze DBA roles. So I can say, hey, select row num to create an ID, and then just select the player name from it, which comes from the distinct names as player name. You all know T-SQL. This is really easy, really straightforward to do. And now let's say I want to do a facts table, and this is where I'm really happy about. Now I can just say, hey, I can go and join data from that bronze database with that current warehouse that I have, and then just create a table out of this. And this opens up the whole experience that you can now just go and combine that Spark lakehouse database that you have, and then use a warehouse, and then just make cross-DB queries, writing stored procedures to have your business analytics that you have and that you've written, and based upon T-SQL language. This is, you could also achieve that with Spark, but you can now also achieve that with warehouse. And warehouse links to lakehouse because it's all one big experience. You don't have any silos anymore. You can basically use Spark data, query them with that SQL endpoint. You can use that and load that data into your warehouse, but that warehouse data will be in one lake, which will be accessible again, and then and so on and so on and so on and so on. Also, maybe one cool thing to note, that one lake you can also connect to with Azure Storage Explorer with it. So you can actually go and see what that data looks like and how it works. Now, the final bit I want to talk about is now building a report on that. So as you know, business users do want to have reports, and normally you would have sort of direct query mode or import mode, or you could combine them with incremental refreshes and hybrid modes and all that stuff. It's basically the legacy way of doing things now with Fabric. Because with Fabric, we basically have something called direct lake mode, which will scan all these objects and already load it to sort of an AAS that's in between, and gives you great query performance directly of that data coming from one lake. It basically caches some data in there. It's an older version. Anyway, so it basically is direct lake, and it's, so you basically create a model and sort of a data set, and that data set you can access using Power BI. But let me show you how that works. So as you can see over here, it's a little bit hidden. Over here, there's this thing called model. And if I can go and model my data over there, this is where Power BI can start using that data. Let's say model And then I can say, hey, this roles table is linked to this username table. User ID is the same as this user ID over here. Okay, once you've done that, you can actually go and say, hey, let's switch over to Power BI. And now let's say I want to create a new report and then say, pick a published data set. And you see here, I have these data sets, and the ones I'm interested in is this one that came from roles. And then, because I'm very lazy, I'm going to say auto create report, because I'm not the biggest Power BI expert, but this shows me already some analysis of my data, and it will show me like, it will automatically generate sort of reports on it. So let's say this is based upon that usernames, but hey, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in race. I'm interested in class, and I want to see the average role that they do. You can see that it automatically revamps that report in a very, very fast way. This is querying straight on it. And then, there you go. So we get like all these fancy reports built upon those average roles. So a Dragonborn is the best role to have, like a high role, which means you get a 6.38, and a Warlock gets a 6.37. And then, for example, I want to not have count of rows here. I might want to have this by user ID, see which users have the most frequent high roles, and it automatically just changes that. But you can also still just use Power BI and create your own report out of it. So you can see here, user 34 always run roles 20, so it's probably cheap. Okay. Now, that's it on Power BI. So basically, Microsoft Fabric does it all. It's all in one unified solution. It's a unified SaaS-based solution that stores every bit of data and anything that you're using in ETL that you used to use in SQL Server BI solutions, what you're doing in lakehouses. It's all unified in one platform, and it all interconnects very easily. You've seen with the shortcuts and all those things. You've got T-SQL language you can use in every layer. You've got Spark language you can do using every layer. It just connects really well, and it works really well. It's performant as well. Any questions?
Yes, we have a couple of questions for you now.
Are they on the Q&A part?
Yes, the first one is by Adrian Darby, and he's kind of scared, I think, asking, can we still use Synapse outside Fabric?
Yeah, sure, still there.
So the normal Synapse still exists, and everything.
Yeah, it still exists. Yeah, and it's still supported. There'll still be some changes coming there as well, but as such, Synapse can still be used. But let's say that Fabric is it's public preview now, and it's usually something where more things will be built upon, and those should integrate as well.
And also, Wright is asking, because he can't find, where is it? Can you connect to it? You said you can connect with Storage Explorer, but where do you locate it?
Yeah, there is a properties thing where you can load it. Actually, in about 5 days, there will be a Fabric Espresso, which will show you exactly that thing. If you want, I can ping you over where you can find those connections.
Cool. So let's move on to the next question. So have many of the Delta incompatibilities with Synapse that have been fixed in Fabric also been fixed within serverless and dedicated pools?
So it's still built upon the open source version, sort of. There are some bigger changes coming to it, and it's more incremental. So we're closing the gap, but it doesn't support everything that Databricks has at this point in time.
Why is it better to handle notebooks and data in the lakehouse than in Databricks or in the Synapse notebook experience? Or is it better or just more convenient?
So as such, if you look at Synapse and Fabric, there are some issues that we have in Synapse Spark, like the startup times and the sharing of the sessions, which are solved in Fabric. Will those changes come to Synapse? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know everything what they're planning. But as such, Synapse Spark and Fabric, I think you will more enjoy the Fabric experience, but Spark can still do everything. Synapse Spark. As to Databricks and Fabric and Databricks and Synapse can coexist well. You can do, if you've built a lot of frameworks in Databricks, that Databricks can prepare the delta tables up to silver or gold, and you can tap into that with Microsoft Fabric using a shortcut to that ADLS storage where you paste it in that Databricks. But all three engines can achieve the same thing. There will be quirks to each one of them. So it's depending on where you want to put your development investment, because that also costs money.
Okay, cool. So this could take you a while to answer this question, but the question is, we have just started engineering a data lakehouse and reporting platform using traditional Synapse tools, Azure architecture, and Power BI. Should we stop and seriously consider switching to Fabric?
No, because Fabric is such thing that's now in public preview. And if you're basically building something in Synapse, it should be portable to Fabric. It's pretty straightforward to answer.
Okay, great. So we move on to Kevin Young's question, which I think you've kind of answered, but it's probably worth me just pulling it out again. So using Fabric, is star schema still used in creating the data warehouse?
Yeah, you can still do it. I would still do it. And basically, one big flat table can work as well, but the larger the volume, the harder it will be to actually get that performance, and probably the more cost will be related to it.
So, and we have, I believe, the last question for now. And that would be Anne that asks, when you create the fact and dimension tables, are those logical tables and the data is actually stored as one copy in the bronze?
Those are still actual tables that will be created because they're built. You cannot build everything with logic above it. Just imagine that there's a load of business logic that's above it. So we basically have a warehouse that stores that data also for caching purposes. So if you create fact and dimensions, you will not just keep the bronze order table and the bronze sale table and the customers table and all that stuff. It's still a layered solution. So you have one copy of your data. However, you still have those three different layers, which have three different sort of data sets. Because bronze will be different from silver, silver will be different from gold. And gold can then be seen as your data warehouse, but it's still all on the Delta format underneath in one lake.
So if the bronze layer is updated, will the fact and dimension tables, so to say, be updated in the warehouse?
That will happen through your cleansing, because you don't want anything that you update in your bronze table to automatically apply to it. You want to have a framework running over it, checking that everything that you've done validates to business logic. So that's still the scheduling mechanisms with pipelines where you're going to have a flow like bronze, we're having this, silver is this, gold is this.
So you still have to plan and work. There's no magic.
There's no magic yet.
Yet. Interesting.
I don't know what they're planning. I don't know what they're planning. So that's why I say yet. You never know.
So we've got what is now the last question from Adrian, and it's a great question because we're currently looking at this on my own project. He says
there is something in there. So it's Dataverse thing in there. There is something called a link. I haven't looked into it, to be honest, but I know there's something in there.
But the question is, we pull data from Dynamics 365 using Synapse Link for Dataverse. Mm-hmm. Is this available in Fabric? So
I have to look into. I think it is, but there are some links that are in there. Let me get back to you on that question because I actually had a discussion about that today. So I need to check if that's really in there.
And presumably, if it's not there now, it will be coming.
It will be. Yeah. This is still public preview, subject to a lot of changes. It's a product. It's like a first release. It's like you're testing, and out of your feedback, things will change.
Cool. So that was then the last question. And I say, as always, thanks for joining us. And a big thanks to Stijn.
Thank you very much. It was my joy to do this.